It was a day like any other in Judge Rachel Thompson's courtroom, except for one thing. The case in front of her was anything but ordinary. On the docket was Luke Harris, a 16-year-old teenager with a history of minor run-ins with the law. Today, however, he stood accused of something far more serious: vandalism and destruction of property. The incident had made headlines across the city, involving damage to a local business that had been hit hard by the economic downturn. Luke had been caught spray painting the exterior of a beloved family-owned bakery, the heart of the community for nearly 50 years. The owner, Mrs. Walker, an elderly woman who had poured her heart and soul into the bakery, was devastated by the damage. The community was split. Some believed Luke's actions were the result of frustration from a life filled with hardship, while others thought he was simply a delinquent teenager in need of punishment. Judge Thompson had heard the facts. She knew about Luke's family situation. His father was in prison, and his mother struggled to make ends meet working two low-paying jobs. He had been bouncing from foster home to foster home, never truly finding a sense of stability. But none of that excused his actions. She had seen many teenagers like Luke, full of potential but often led astray by circumstances beyond their control. As the trial began, Luke sat in the defendant's chair, his hands trembling. He avoided eye contact with anyone in the courtroom, his hoodie pulled low over his face. He was a typical teenager in appearance, but there was something in his eyes, something vulnerable, perhaps even lost. The prosecutor laid out the case with an air of certainty, detailing the destruction done to the bakery's facade. It was clear that Mrs. Walker was devastated, and the victim impact statement only added weight to the case. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Luke said quietly when it was his turn to speak. His voice was small, barely audible in the echoing silence of the courtroom. "I wasn't thinking clearly. It's just, everything's been so hard lately. I didn't know where to go or what to do. I just wanted to express myself." Judge Thompson listened closely, her brow furrowed in thought. She had heard similar excuses in the past: anger, confusion, and frustration. But there was something about Luke's words, the way he seemed to shrink further into himself as he spoke, that made her hesitate. Then, unexpectedly, something happened that no one could have predicted. The courtroom, which had been filled with tension, fell into an eerie silence as Mrs. Walker, who had been sitting in the front row, stood up slowly and walked toward the judge's bench. She was an elderly woman with a kind face, her frailty evident in every step she took. She didn't ask for permission to speak. She just did, as if the moment had come and she had no choice. "Your Honor," Mrs. Walker said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I would like to say something. I've been thinking about all of this, about the damage done to my business, the way Luke hurt me and my bakery. But something inside me tells me there's more to this story. I know that Luke didn't mean to harm me, and I know that he's been through a lot." The courtroom was now filled with murmurs. Mrs. Walker, the victim, was speaking in defense of the defendant. The prosecutor looked confused, unsure how to react, while the defense attorney glanced at Luke, who was staring at the floor, avoiding any attention. "I've run my bakery for over 40 years, Mrs. Walker continued, her eyes now focused solely on Luke. "I've been through some tough times myself, losing my husband, raising my children on my own, but I never once considered giving up. I always believed that kindness and understanding were the way forward, even when the world seemed unfair. And that's why I'm here today." She paused for a moment, then turned toward Luke, her voice softening. "Look, I know you didn't mean to hurt me. You didn't mean to tear down something that's been my life's work. But I've also seen pain in your eyes. I've seen that struggle, the kind that doesn't go away with time. I want to offer you a chance to make things right." Everyone in the room was now staring at Mrs. Walker. What was she saying? Was she really offering a chance to the teenager who had hurt her so deeply? Judge Thompson, too, was taken aback. She had seen many victims demand justice, but never before had she seen one offer mercy with such sincerity. Luke looked up, his eyes wide. For the first time, he met Mrs. Walker's gaze. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. How could he apologize for something like this? How could he make it right? "I don't know what to say," Luke finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Walker smiled softly. "You don't need to say anything, dear. I want to help you. If you're willing, I'll pay for the repairs to the bakery. I'll even offer you a job here if you want it. A job to learn the value of hard work and community. I know you're capable of so much more than this." Judge Thompson watched as the courtroom absorbed Mrs. Walker's unexpected act of kindness. She had expected the situation to escalate into a lengthy sentencing process, but this had changed everything. There was a heavy silence as everyone waited for Luke's response. Luke stood up slowly, still in shock. His eyes welled up with tears, but he quickly wiped them away. He had no idea what to say to someone who had been so kind when all he had done was wrong. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. I don't deserve this, but I'll work hard. I promise." Mrs. Walker nodded, her face filled with compassion. "We all deserve a second chance, Luke. It's not too late to turn things around." Judge Thompson was silent for a moment, her thoughts racing. She had seen many cases like this in her career, but she had never seen a victim extend such grace. Finally, she spoke, her voice firm yet filled with understanding. "Mrs. Walker, your act of kindness is not lost on me, nor on this court. Luke, I believe you've been given an opportunity that many never receive. I hope you take it seriously." She paused, looking at both Luke and Mrs. Walker before adding, "I'm going to defer judgment on this case, pending your completion of the community service at Mrs. Walker's bakery. If you honor this offer and work diligently, I will consider this case resolved." The courtroom was silent for a moment as the weight of the decision settled in. Luke stood there, overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. Mrs. Walker had forgiven him in a way that no one else had, and now it was up to him to prove that he was worthy of her kindness. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the hearing, Luke looked at Mrs. Walker one last time, his gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered again, this time with a sincerity that went far beyond words. The courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary that day. A teenager's crime had been met not with vengeance, but with compassion. And in that moment, everyone knew that Luke's life would never be the same again. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, subscribe, and share.